Really bad. It's looking really bad right now. The man's nervous and shaking voice echoed on the radio, loud alarms blaring in the background. He'd given his ship's coordinates, and help was on the way. Fear flooded the ship as well as thousands of tons of water. Screams filled the air, piercing above the sound of whistling wind and splashing waves. The ship creaked and groaned as it tilted further and further, the hallways turning sideways and the stairwells becoming impossible to climb. Everyone aboard awaited rescue, but it would be too late. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Welcome to our final installment in our remembrance of MS Estonia and her victims. Today we get into her tragic sinking, the controversies and conspiracies surrounding the sinking, and where she is today. If you haven't seen any of the other episodes in this series, I highly recommend watching those first. Without any further ado, let us go in på din historien. We left off with MS Estonia setting out from Tallinn, Estonia on September 27, 1994 at 7:15 p.m., slightly behind schedule. She was expected in Stockholm, Sweden the following morning between 9 and 9:15 a.m., carrying between 989 and 1,058 total. The official numbers list 803 passengers and 186 crew, though subsequent analysis suggests there are 69 further people left unaccounted for. She was fully loaded with cargo, with between 61 and 83 cars on the car deck, including trucks and alleged military vehicles, according to eyewitness testimony. As MS Estonia set out, she was heading out into a storm. Several ROROs ferries were heading out into the Baltic Sea that night, and these storms were seen as pretty normal. MS Estonia had weathered numerous storms in the past, and as the Vasa King, she had quite the reputation as a reliable vessel in bad weather. However, her cargo was poorly distributed, which led to a slight list to starboard, already setting off her balance heading out into the storm that night. What happened that night is highly debated, so we will go with two major variations of the story: the official disaster report and the witnesses' version of events according to the documentary Estonia. I'll be switching back and forth, and I'll let you know when we switch perspectives. Let's start with the final disaster report. According to it, the weather was rough. The wind speeds reached 15 to 25 meters per second, registered as a force of 7 to 10 on the Beaufort scale, and a significant wave height of 4 to 6 meters. This is close compared to the highest measured significant wave height in the Baltic Sea of 7.7 meters. According to modeled satellite data, wind gusts were in excess of 85 to 100 kilometers per hour at 1 a.m. that night over the Baltic Sea. However, MS Estonia never reached this portion of the sea before her sinking. There was some intermittent rain, and the temperature of the water was around 10 degrees Celsius. According to the captain of MS Silja Europa, Captain Esa Makela, the weather was, quote, normally bad, and typical for an autumn storm in the Baltic Sea. So, with it being so normal, all scheduled passenger ferries took to the sea that night, which was totally normal, and would also glean some understanding as to why passengers felt so secure in boarding ferries that night. The official report lists an unknown speed for Estonia that night. However, her schedule was very regular, and she kept schedule very nicely, averaging 16 to 17 knots. However, according to the chief mate of MS Dyalla, Estonia's speed clocked in at about 14.2 knots on radar before the first signs of distress, and the Silja Europa's officers estimated her speed at 14 to 15 knots at midnight. Official reports and eyewitness testimony agree that before the disaster, most of the voyage seemed rather normal for a stormy night. Of course, the ship swayed in the waves, but there was karaoke in the nightclub, including a competition to win a free drink. Several children were on board returning home from a field trip to Estonia. Business people were aboard heading to Stockholm for a conference, and of course there were passengers just heading home. Many went to bed, looking to sleep off most of the approximate 14-hour voyage. Det såg ut som en typisk natt på MS Estonia, men det var allt annat an. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comment section below. Okay, alla, låt oss gå in I tragedin. According to the final disaster report, the first sign of trouble came around 1 a.m. with a loud metallic bang that rang out throughout the vessel. The assumption is that a heavy wave hit the bow doors when the ship was on the outskirts of the Turku archipelago. However, this is debated even within the report itself, as an inspection by the crew limited to checking the indicator lights for the ramp and visor showed no problems. Over the next 10 minutes, similar clanking and metallic noises were reported by crew and passengers. It must have been eerie to hear such things at dead of night like this. At about 1:15 a.m., the bow visor is believed to have separated and torn open the loading ramp behind it. Immediately, water flooded into the already unbalanced car deck and cargo area, and Estonia started to lift sharply to the starboard side, initially around 15 degrees. Around 1:20 a.m., it is reported that a quiet female voice called out over the ship's public address system, "Haira, haira, leval on haira," which is Estonian for alarm, alarm, there is alarm on the ship, letting everyone on the ship know there's a problem. The general emergency signal started howling throughout the ship, alerting passengers to the boat deck where the lifeboats are kept. The severe list and flooding prevented many people in the cabins from getting up to the boat deck, as water not only came in from the car deck, but also through windows in cabins, as well as the massive windows along deck 6. The windows were unable to withstand the waves as water buffeted its way in, and the sea reached the upper decks. Survivors reported that the water flowed down from ceiling panels, stairwells, and along corridors from decks that were not yet underwater, and this greatly contributed to how rapidly Estonia was sinking. At 1:22 a.m., MS Estonia communicated a mayday but did not follow international formats. After this, Estonia directed a call to Silja Europa, one of the closest ships to her at this point. Only after making contact with her did the radio operator ever mention the word mayday. The radio operator on Silja Europa, Chief Mate Teo Seppelin, replied in English, "Estonia, are you calling mayday?" After this, the third mate of Estonia, Andres Tames, took over, and the conversation continued in Finnish. When listening to it, you can hear the confusion and fear in the crew's voices as well as alarms blaring. They weren't able to provide their position immediately due to a blackout. This delayed rescue operations somewhat. Silja Europa and Mariella, two ships in the area, were in contact with one another and working on a plan to head down to Estonia. Sometime later, either the power returned or someone on the bridge was able to lower him or herself down to the starboard side of the bridge to check the marine GPS, which displays the ship's position even in a blackout. Tomason radioed back to Silja Europa, frantically giving their position. Europa's operator remained calm, took note of the position, and promised to send help right away. After this, Tomes tells Europa's operator in Finnish, "Really bad. It's looking really bad right now." Europa's operator acknowledges this and confirms the location, and Tomes utters the last words heard from Estonia. "It is clear what you said." Sadly, Tomes would die in the sinking, more than likely drowning just a few minutes after this last message was uttered. By 1:30, the ship had rolled to a 60-degree angle, and by 1:50, the list was at 90 degrees as tons of water completely flooded the car deck. At the last minute, MS Estonia was turned to port slowly and slowed just before her engines shut down completely. She disappeared from radar screens at 1:50 a.m., sinking at 59 degrees 23 minutes north, 21 degrees 41 minutes east in international waters, roughly 22 nautical miles on bearing 157 degrees from Uto Island, Finland, at a depth of 245 to 280 feet of water. According to survivors, the ship sank stern first after taking a list of 90 degrees to the starboard side. However, many of the survivor accounts do differ on a few key points. Firstly, the time the sinking took place. They state it was sometime around 11 or midnight, not 1 a.m. They also state the mechanical banging sound heard throughout the ship was more akin to that of an explosion or collision. What I find odd is the nature of the sinking. I'm no architect, but if the bow visor and car ramp were truly to blame, wouldn't have Estonia sunk bow first rather than stern first? This is just another question added to the many the world has, if the damn thing ever opened in the first place. Prior to dives in 2021, it had been reported that the car ramp was closed, meaning it could not have caused the sinking. However, according to a dive performed in July of 2021, the car ramp is open. Våldens frågor kanske aldrig besvaras. Och tyvärr går inte frågorna från offrens familjära detaljer. This episode couldn't be possible without our amazing YouTube members and patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Nu fortsätter vi med skeppsbrottet. The search and rescue operations are not debated in the least, so we will cover that first. Search and rescue followed arrangements set up under the 1979 International Convention on Maritime Search and Rescue, or SAR Convention for short. The nearest Maritime Rescue Coordination Center, MRCC Turku, coordinated the effort in accordance with Finland's plans after much back and forth between them, Silja Europa, and Marjala. The Baltic Sea is one of the world's busiest shipping areas, with 2,000 vessels at sea at any time, and these plans assumed the ship's own boats and nearby ferries would provide immediate help, and that helicopters could be airborne after an hour. This scheme had previously worked for the relatively small number of accidents involving sinkings in the past, particularly as most ships have few people on board. Like I briefly mentioned, Marjala was already on her way, and so she arrived at 2:12 a.m., the first of 5 ferries to reach the scene of the accident. MRCC Turku failed to acknowledge the Mayday immediately, and Marjala's report was relayed by Helsinki radio as the less urgent Pan-Pan message. The radio telephony message Pan-Pan is the international standard urgency signal that someone aboard a boat, ship, aircraft, or other vehicle uses to declare that they need help and that the situation is urgent, but does not pose an immediate threat to anyone's life at the moment. The message is as follows.
Pan, all stations. Pan, all stations, Helsinki radio calling, Pan, calling, Mayday, 27th of September at 23:24 GMT on 2182 from passenger ship Estonia, Echo Sierra Tango Echo, in position 5922 North 2148 East. Stop. East 20 to 30 degrees. All ships in vicinity keep sharp lookout and inform Finnish Coast Guard on Channel 16. Pan Helsinki radio.
Many of the calls between the ships, Coast Guard, and MRCC seem very calm and bounce between Swedish, Finnish, and English, though they all understand one another, which is miraculous to me. As an American that only knows English, that is impressive. A full-scale emergency was finally declared at 2:30. Marjala winched open life rafts into the sea, onto which 13 people on Estonia's rafts successfully transferred, and reported the location of other rafts to Swedish and Finnish rescue helicopters. The first of these helicopters arrived at 3:05 a.m. The Swedes took survivors to shore, and the Finnish border guard helicopters Super Puma OH-HVG and Augusta Bella 412 OH-HVD chose the riskier option of landing on the ferries. The pilot of OH-HVD actually said the most difficult part of the rescue operation was landing on the ferries. However, this single helicopter saved 44 people itself, more than all 5 of the ferries in the area. MS Isabella saved 16 survivors with her rescue slide. The ships involved were Marjala, Silja Europa, Silja Symphony, Isabella, and Finjet. Silja Europa was in control of the radio traffic and coordinating much of the rescue mission, and they did so very gracefully. I will leave a link to the full Mayday Call in the description of this episode if you would like to hear it, and the same thing goes for my audio-only listeners. The ferries played a very small part in the rescue because of the difficult nature of the weather. It was volatile, and Marjala reported lifeboats, people, and debris in the area. The ships were scared of running people over, and so they couldn't get as close as was intended. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a possible 69 unaccounted for passengers that could raise the death toll from 852 to 921. Since this is unconfirmed, I'll mention it here to make sure any possible victims are acknowledged. Moving forward, we are going to look at the statistics from the official numbers. Of the 989 confirmed aboard, 138 were rescued, one of whom later died at the hospital from exposure. Ships rescued 34 of these people, and helicopters rescued 104. Most of those who perished were trapped within the ship because of the quick flooding and rapid listing, drowning in their cabins. According to the investigating commission, up to 310 might have made it to the top deck. About 160 of those individuals made it into life rafts, many of which failed to inflate properly or were upside down. There was no time to launch the ship's lifeboats, and the water was incredibly cold. Many people, hastily rolling out of bed and running to safety, were poorly dressed or had no life jackets, or both. One survivor was only in his boxer shorts, and miraculously, he survived to tell the tale. This was considered what is called an uncontrolled abandonment, with the captain blowing the horn one last time to warn survivors to jump and get away from the ship before she sank. He was already underwater when he did so, and would die in the sinking. Those who fell or jumped into the water without life jackets or who were badly injured, quote, succumbed so quickly that no rescue could have reached them in time, according to the commission. One of the victims of the sinking was the Estonian singer Urmas Elender. In total, only 94 bodies were recovered. 93 were recovered within 33 days of the incident, and the last victim was recovered 18 months afterward. By the time rescue helicopters whirred onto the scene, a third of those who'd managed to escape Estonia had died of hypothermia in the harsh conditions, while fewer than half of those who had managed to leave the ship were eventually rescued. The survivors were mostly young, fit men with strong constitutions, with 111 survivors being male and only 26 being female. Only 7 people over the age of 55 survived the loss of Estonia, and no one aboard the ship under the age of 12 survived. It's been estimated that when MS Estonia went beneath the waves, roughly 650 people were trapped within the ship, and they surely drowned. Last week, I told you about the nationalities of all of those on board. This week, we'll do that for the victims and survivors. Of the victims, 461 were Swedish, 237 were Estonian, 19 were Latvian, 10 were Russian, 9 were Finnish, 6 were Norwegian, 4 were German, 5 were Danish, 3 were Lithuanian, 2 were Moroccan, 1 was Dutch, 1 was Ukrainian, 1 was English, 1 was Belarusian, 1 was Canadian, 1 was French, and 1 was Nigerian. Of the survivors, 51 were Swedish, 62 were Estonian, 6 were Latvian, 4 were Russian, 3 were Finnish, 3 were Norwegian, 3 were German, 1 was Danish, 1 was Lithuanian, none were Moroccan, 1 was Dutch, 1 was Ukrainian, 1 was English, none were Belarusian, none were Canadian, none were French, and none were Nigerian. Of the bodies recovered, 40 were Swedish, 47 were Estonian, 4 were Latvian, 1 was Russian, 1 was Finnish, and 1 was German. The rest of the victims are either still missing or still remain within the wreckage. I've been giving you a lot of numbers, but it's important to remember that these people were just that. Human beings with families and feelings. They were mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, uncles, aunts, grandparents, friends, cousins. They were teachers, business people, construction workers, students, immigrants, healthcare workers, leaders, crew. Rest in peace to the victims of the sinking of MS Estonia. May we never forget and always keep their story alive. We are going to look at the official explanation for the sinking, some of the conspiracies, and the overall consensus moving forward. Before we get into it, it's important to note that the wreck of MS Estonia is treated as a gravesite, and private investigation was illegal for a long time, except for in countries that did not sign the Sanctity Treaty. The wreck has also been partially entombed in pebbles, and this combined with the laws against private investigation have led many, including myself, to wonder what the Swedish government is hiding. And it's also angered many of the victims' families, since they demanded the wreck be raised so their loved ones could rightfully receive a land burial. Divers have been quoted as saying diving and recovering the bodies back in 1994 would have been very doable, so it's odd no one was allowed to go down there. Initially, the wreck was examined and videotaped by ROVs and divers from a Norwegian company, Rockwater AS, contracted for investigative work. In the official report, it's indicated that the locks on the bow door had failed from the stress of the waves, separating the door from the ship and pulling the ramp ajar. This is possible as the bow visor and ramp had been torn off at points that would not trigger an open or unlatched warning on the bridge, which is what normally happens with a failure. The bridge was also so far back on the ship that there was no way they could see the bow visor from there. There was video monitoring of the inner ramp, but the monitor on the bridge wasn't visible from the conning station. The first bang was believed to have been the sound of the visor's lower locking mechanism failing, and the following noises would be the visor flapping against the hull until the other locks failed, before tearing free and exposing the car ramp. The failure of the ramp afterward allowed water to spill into the vehicle deck, which was identified as the main cause of the sinking due to the free surface effect. The free surface effect plagues many RORO ferries that sink, and it's the sloshing of water that makes the ship unstable, unable to right itself in a wave, and causes it to capsize. This is evident in the sinkings of MS Herald of Free Enterprise, MV Princess of the Stars, MV Princess Victoria, and MV Salem Express, all ships we've covered in the past. The report was very critical of the crew's actions, particularly for failing to reduce speed before investigating the noises emanating from the bow, and for being unaware that the list was caused by water entering the vehicle deck. There were also general criticisms of the delays in sounding the alarm, the passivity of the crew, and the lack of guidance from the bridge. Recommendations for modifications to be applied to similar ships included separation of the condition sensors from the latch and hinge mechanisms. After these investigations, some major changes were made. In 1999, special training requirements in crowd and crisis management, as well as human behavior, were extended to crew on all passenger ships, and amendments were made to watchkeeping standards. Estonia's distress beacons, or EPIRBs, required manual activation, which did not happen, and if they had been automatically activated, it would have immediately been obvious she was in distress and her location would have been clear. After this, all EPIRBs were subsequently required to deploy automatically, and this event was, quote, instrumental in the move to legislate voyage data recorders, or VDRs. It's essentially the ship version of an airplane black box. New life raft regulations for rescue from listing ships in rough water were introduced. New designs, dubbed the Citadel concept, aim to ensure damaged ships have sufficient buoyancy to remain afloat, but cost will determine if any of these particular designs are built. SOLAS 90, in effect as of 2010, specifies existing passenger ship stability requirements, and those in Northwest Europe must also be able to survive 20 inches of water on the car deck. On September 28, 2020, the fantastic Swedish documentary Estonia on Discovery Plus was released. It's a heartbreaking, informative watch, and I highly recommend it. This project utilized ROVs to film the wreck. This investigation discovered a 4-meter hole in the ship's hull. This prompted the Estonian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister to meet with their Swedish and Finnish equivalents and announce that a, quote, new technical investigation would follow. Just a side note, there are claims that the holes in the hull were created by bedrock as the ship settled, which might be true, but I can't find a reputable source for this, only Reddit. I just wanted to bring it to your attention, but take it with a grain of salt. The head of the Estonian investigation, Margus Kurm, stated publicly that he believes this new information points to the possible collision with a submarine, and that the hull could not have happened post-sinking. This lines up with some eyewitness accounts that claim to have seen a submarine in the water near the ship. In October of 2020, the Estonian government published a report stating the hull was too small to have sunk the ship as quickly as she foundered, and the Swedish documentary workers were prosecuted for violating the sanctity of the wreck, but were acquitted on February 8, 2021, as the diving happened on a German ship in international waters, and Germany had not signed the treaty that declares sanctity over the site. However, there was a retrial in September 2022, and they were found guilty and fined. By June of 2021, laws were finally passed allowing the examination of the wreck for investigation of the disaster in the Swedish and Estonian parliaments. Shortly after, the Swedish Accident Investigation Authority announced their plan for dives starting in July 2021, and in July of 2023, they recovered the car ramp. Between 2021 and 2022, Estonian, Finnish, and Swedish authorities carried out comprehensive wreck surveys using cameras, 3D photogrammetry, 3D laser scanners, and shallow and mid-penetration sub-bottom profilers, among other equipment. This was to identify the cause of penetrating deformations to the hull of MS Estonia and assess whether the safety investigation of the sinking should be reopened. In January of 2023, the Swedish Accident Investigation Authority released the intermediate report of the preliminary assessment of MS Estonia following the joint investigation. According to the report, there was, quote, no indication of a collision with a vessel or a floating object. Neither was there, quote, indication of an explosion in the bow area. Also, an oil leak was found on the hull's aft section, and that the Finnish border guard is monitoring the leakage. The ship was also deemed, quote, not seaworthy, and its certificate of seaworthiness, issued January 28, 1993, was incorrect because, firstly, an inspection of the bow parts following regulations, which would have led to the discovery of the flaws in the visor, was not performed. Secondly, the exemption regarding the location of the bow ramp as the upper extension of the collision bulkhead was not recorded in certificates. The report concluded that if the inspection was performed and the exemption noted, quote, the vessel would not have been trading the Tallinn-Stockholm route, and, quote, the accident would probably not have occurred. The bow ramp and some metal parts that were cut from the hull by divers in the 1990s were salvaged in July of 2023. Multiple conspiracies exist surrounding the sinking, and it's not surprising given the secretive, uncertain nature of everything. German journalist Jutta Rabe and the British magazine New Statesman claim that laboratory tests on debris recovered illegally from Estonia's bow yielded trace evidence of a deliberate explosion, which they allege was covered up by the Swedish, British, and Russian governments to conceal an intelligence operation smuggling military equipment on a civilian ferry, which is illegal according to international maritime laws. However, this is debated. Members of the Joint Accident Investigation Commission denied these claims, saying that the damage seen on the debris occurred during the visor's detachment from the ship. The JAIC cited results from Germany's Federal Institute for Materials Research and Testing, which found that Jutta Rabe's samples did not prove an explosion occurred. I personally do not believe in the explosion theory. There's also the conspiracy theory that a Soviet submarine rammed the Estonia, also because of the transportation of military equipment aboard MS Estonia. This theory matches up almost perfectly to the size of the hole in the side of the hull discovered by the 2020 documentary Estonia, which had numerous scientific analyses done to determine if this is plausible, and I personally believe it's possible. In the fall of 2004, a former Swedish customs officer claimed on Sveriges Television that Estonia had been used to transport former Soviet military equipment in September of 1994. The Swedish and Estonian governments subsequently launched separate investigations, which both confirmed that non-explosive military equipment was aboard the ship on September 14th and 20th in 1994. According to the Swedish Ministry of Defense, no such equipment was on Estonia on the 28th, and previous investigations by the Swedish Customs Service found no reports of any anomalous activity around the day of the disaster. That seems too convenient for me, especially since eyewitnesses claim to have seen military-looking trucks driven up the car ramp onto Estonia on the 27th. I personally think there was non-explosive military equipment and/or vehicles on Estonia that night. So, what do I think? I'm no expert, more of an armchair enthusiast, but if you were to ask me, I think the bow advisor did become detached and at least had something to do with the sinking, if not the only reason for it. I'm not sure about the bow ramp, since there's compelling evidence that it was still attached when she sank. However, I was compelled by the evidence presented by the Estonia documentary and the survivors interviewed there. I personally believe the events were much different than the official report states, even if mostly on the timing of the sequences that took place. I did reach out to Vrak, Museum of Wrecks in Stockholm, Sweden, to see if they take donations, but I haven't heard back from them. I also looked to see if the victims' families are accepting donations in any capacity, but it looks like their last project elapsed in 2021. So if you could please send well wishes to both Vrak Museum of Wrecks and the victims' families and friends on social media or our comments section, that would be wonderful. I want to leave as much of an impact as I can, and if I can figure out some donations in the future, I'll let you know. MS Estonia has had a major impact on ferry safety, leading to numerous changes in safety regulation and design, much as the sinking of RMS Titanic did in 1912. The sinking of MS Estonia is considered to be one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in the history of man. It's easy to see why, with how tragic it was. Rest in peace to the victims of this disaster. And to the families, friends, loved ones, and survivors, I wish you nothing but the best, and I truly hope one day the whole truth is revealed, justice will be provided as well as closure, and that the victims can one day be raised and buried. That's the end of our remembrance of MS Estonia 30 years later, and thank you all so much for being here. Stay tuned tomorrow as I'll be posting a compilation of the building and sinking of MS Estonia episodes. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our MS Estonia 30 Years Later playlist in the cards. Tune in next week for the story of RMS Titanic, a White Star liner that became one of the world's first armed merchant cruisers. Tack för att du ställer in Shipwreck Sunday. Ha en bra vecka så ses vi nästa gång.